Hello, everyone. I'm Corwin Marshall Parker. Welcome to our second discussion board post for History 701. As we talked about last week, my research interest involves the American Colonization Society. With feedback from our professor, I decided that I would continue to fine tune this research interest to talk about the missiological implications of the American Colonization Society in juxtaposition to its economic and political aims, which are largely focused on by historians. In an article by Kharem, Chapter 4, The American Colonization Society from Counterpoints, he discussed that the presence of freed African Americans in the antebellum United States was referred to historically as the Negro Problem. In his analysis, he utilized letters and speeches and other primary sources to talk about how effectively the aims of the American Colonization Society, while missiological in origin, were in fact a racist enterprise in an attempt to rid African Americans, notably freed blacks, from the shores of the United States. The impetus for this removal was effectively American Protestantism. In an 1831 quote from Cyrus Edwards, no matter how great their industry or how abundant their wealth, no matter what their attainments in literature, science, or the arts, they can never, no, never be raised to a footing of equality. A black abolitionist by John Rock, who's also a lawyer, asked the question, why is it that the white people in this country desire to get rid of us? That much of the wealth and prosperity found here is the result of the labor of our hands. So this encapsulates effectively the economic enterprise that African Americans represented, but yet what was the reason for wanting to rid African Americans, or at least rid the United States, of this freed black presence? So Kharem asserts that this refusal to promote equality traces its origins to the Anglo Protestant cultural foundations of what would become the United States. This ideal of a homogeneous all-white nation and removing free blacks from living next to white people began actually in 1691 in the colony of Virginia, which prohibited any further emancipation of enslaved blacks unless the owner provided transportation beyond the limits of the Virginia colony within 6 months after emancipation. Cohn and other scholars have called patriotism, as a matter of fact, the most effective vehicle to cultivate loyalty to the state and society, and it fostered, according to Kharem, this enthusiasm for the federal government, a common Anglo-Protestant American language and geography, and a distinctive national history. Kharem asserts that since the 1600s, Anglo-Protestant Americanism has preached that America is the land in which God will create a new heaven and new earth, and it maintained a sense of divine mission. So Kharem found this sermon from Puritan leader John Winthrop, a model of Christian charity, in which in 1630 he preached that Protestant clergy have referred to the land mass now called the United States as the Promised Land, and its Puritan inhabitants the chosen people. These early Puritans believed that England was the new Israel and the Anglo-Saxon race a holy people favored by God. Puritan leaders, notably Cotton Mather, believed that God had picked them out for a special destiny as heirs to the ancient Israelites, God's chosen people. These Puritan leaders, including Mather, saw America as a flawless utopian paradise, the New Jerusalem, emerging in a world of sin and discontent. These Anglo-Protestants living in what became the United States believed that they had become or would become superior, according to Kharem, all other nations, or superior to all other nations and peoples, and fulfill God's mission as his chosen people. In Cotton Mather's treatise, The Negro Christianized, an essay to excite and assist that good work, the instruction of Negro servants in Christianity, Mather counseled Boston slave owners that black people caused not only physical concern, but also God had no intention of making blacks being part of the new Israel. He stated, while Christianized blacks made better slaves, my Negroes will not prove part of the Israel of God and will not be gathered unto the Lord. Winthrop Jordan, in his book, White Over Black, American Attitudes Towards the Negro, 1550 to 1812, felt that the English described the people of Africa as unattractive, unchristian, and grossly uncivil. In 1700, the abolitionist Samuel Sewall, in his essay, The Selling of Joseph, as Kharem recounts, defended the equality and liberty of enslaved black people, but his own anti-slavery views include fears of miscegenation. In 1751, in Benjamin Franklin's work, Observations Concerning the Increases of the Mind, he asserts that the Saxons and the English make up the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. In this, Franklin was convinced that North America belonged to the white race and hoped that the numbers of white people would increase. He added in Observations, "Why increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America? I am partial to the complexion of my country." In a draft of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson actually included a clause that blamed the King of England for the enslavement and importation of Africans to the colony. This was done, according to Kharem, despite the fact that Puritan entrepreneurs were heavily involved in the Atlantic slave trade, which was well known to everyone in Congress at that time. This brings us to the American Colonization Society. The large increase in the number of free Africans and those of African descent within this new nation caused many whites from both the North and South to look upon the idea of colonizing black people as the only solution to maintaining a homogeneous and virtuous white nations. So many proponents of colonization contended that it was a philanthropic enterprise, not economic or political. Colonized African Americans would Christianize Africa and implement civilization in a degraded continent. Ella Forbes, in African American Resistance to Colonization, described how after American independence, with this formation of the American Colonization Society, many African Americans actually actively resisted this movement of Africans, or at least proposals of movement of Africans back to Africa. So there were two sides. There were that did agree with colonization, but others, of course, as we said, resisted. Ultimately, these were black abolitionists. Forbes utilizes primary documents, including newspapers and speeches and pamphlets, to talk about this resistance movement. A notable, or the first African American newspaper, was the Freedom's Journal, started in 1827 by John Worstrom and Samuel Cornish. In David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World in 1829, this work is regarded by Forbes as the single event which triggered the quote-unquote Negro Revolt. This appeal in the appeal that Walker made basically said that the man who would not fight in the glorious and heavenly cause of freedom to be delivered from the most wretched, abject, and servile slavery ought to be kept with all his children and family in slavery or in chains to be butchered by his cruel enemies. In Garnett's address to slaves in 1843, he told slaves, "To such degradation, it is sinful in the extreme for you to make voluntary submission. It is your solemn and imperative duty to use every means, both moral, intellectual, and physical, that promise success. You had far better all die immediately than live slaves, and entail your wretchedness upon your posterity. Let your motto be resistance, resistance, resistance." This work, Address of Slaves, actually influenced John Brown in his activities at Harper's Ferry. One group Forbes identified that was active in the anti-slavery movement were the Quakers. In 1851, escaped slaves in Christiana, Pennsylvania, forcefully resisted a slaveholder's attempt to recapture them, according to Forbes. The slave owner was killed and his son was gravely wounded. Most of the blacks escaped to Canada, including their leader, William Parker. Not ironically, that's my father's name. The Christiana resistance is another example, according to Forbes, of how Africans have been relegated to a peripheral position in their own history. Traditional history, however, according to Forbes, has made heroes out of the white Quakers who did no more than stand on the sidelines and remain uninvolved in the actual resistance. The final work that I analyzed was Margaret Hope Bacon's Quakers and Colonization, continuing on with this theme as Quakers as principal actors within this anti-colonization movement. Quakers were not exempt from this universal prejudice. Although their founder, George Fox, according to Bacon, cautioned friends, i.e. Quakers, to provide religious education to their slaves and perhaps to manumit some of them at the time of their owner's death, Quakers did not actually admit blacks to membership until 1796. So in Bacon's analysis, she used primary documents, notably letters written by Quakers to other Quakers, talking about this principal interest of Quakers. One pamphlet that Bacon looked at was the Remarks on Slavery of Black People by John Parrish. in which he argued that God would punish the American people if they did not free their slaves. Black people might achieve as much as whites if given the same opportunities. To those who feared a mixture of races, Parrish admitted there is a deep natural aversion in both races. Ultimately, the Quakers became split on their stance of the colonization movement. They divided into two factions: the Friends and the Orthodox, and the Hicksites. With this factionalization, they developed two publications. The first paper was The Friend, which was the Orthodox paper, and The Friend, or Advocate of the Truth of the Hicksites, was the paper for the Hicksite faction. Ultimately, this split would cause Quakers to feel that they needed to divest themselves from the anti-colonization movement because, on one hand, there was just too much of a fervent interest amongst abolitionists, and on the other, the anti-colonization movement was unsuccessful. However, one lasting letter was written by Miss Beulah Sampson, in which she said, "The momentous enterprise of imparting to the inhabitants of Africa the benefits of civilization beaming with gospel light, there to irradiate the lapse of time during successive generations, it is now pendent before the Christian community of North America. The purpose is sublime and prospect of fulfillment sufficiently clear to soothe an anguish of hope deferred. And should the blessings of heaven ultimately crown thy disinterested exertions for the relief of an oppressed portion of that branch of the human family, while anticipating for them the happy consequences and result of future ages, thy generous and proud heart will enjoy a well-earned conscious satisfaction, the rich reward for the protracted, patient perseverance in the great and good." That is my analysis. Thank you for your time. See you next week.